Okay, so let's go over the answers to the Chapter 14 quiz. This is the quiz on plants you guys took last week. So question number 1, we're talking about the vascular tissue of the plants here. So stems carry water through blank tissue and nutrients through blank tissue. So water is carried through the xylem and nutrients are carried through the phloem. So that's why C is the correct choice here. In question number 2, root systems fall into two major categories. So when we talked about the different types of angiosperms, we touched on the differences here. So there are two main types of root systems are taproot. So that's where you have one major root coming down with smaller roots coming off, kind of like a carrot. And then fibrous is the other one where you just have a large branch of small roots. Question number 3. The leaves of plants serve as the primary sites of what? This is the primary sites of photosynthesis. That's where we have that photosynthesis happening, and then the nutrients, the glucose that's created in photosynthesis is moved throughout the rest of the plant through the phloem. Question number 4. A scientist traversing a remote wooded area discovers what he thinks is a new plant species. He makes observations of the plant and discovers that it produces a nut similar to an acorn and concludes it is what type of plant? So that would be an angiosperm because it has that fruit structure. Anytime there is a nut or a fruit, that ovule, that ovary that develops into that covering around the seed is going to be an angiosperm. Question number 5, which of the following is the characteristic reproductive structure for angiosperm plants? This is the flower. Cones are seen in conifers, which are gymnosperms, and then spores are in the non-seed plants that we talked about, the bryophytes and the seedless vascular plants. So angiosperms are defined by the presence of a flower. Question number 6, the male gamete of a flowering plant is known as blank. This is pollen. So the male gamete is the pollen. Question number 7, which of the following is not a significant event in the evolution of plants? The answer is A, the evolution of the rhizoid. If we look at all of the rest of these, those were major evolutionary events we talked about. The evolution of the flower in the angiosperms, the evolution of the seed in the gymnosperms and angiosperms, the evolution of vascular tissue after the bryophytes, allowing plants to get much bigger, protection of the embryo with the seed. So those are all major events. The evolution of the rhizoid was not a major event we talked about. Question number 8, structures in plants that produce the gametes. These are the gametophytes. The gametophyte produces the gametes through mitosis. The sporophyte produces the spores through meiosis. So gametes are produced by the gametophyte. Question number 9, which of the following statements is not true about the alternation of generations life cycle? So A says spores develop into the gametophyte generation. That is true. Those haploid spores develop into a haploid gametophyte through mitosis. B says the gametophyte produces eggs and sperm. That's true because the gametophyte is producing the gametes. Meiosis produces spores that are haploid. That is true. The sporophyte, parts of the sporophyte undergo meiosis to produce those haploid spores. D says when the sperm fertilizes the egg, a zygote results that develops into the sporophyte. That is also true. We have those gametes that fertilize to create that unicellular diploid zygote. Then that undergoes mitosis to develop into the sporophyte, the multicellular diploid structure. Choice E says the sporophyte generation produces spores by mitosis in structures called sporangia. So the sporophyte does produce spores in structures called sporangia, but those spores are produced by meiosis. So that's why E is not true. Question 10, which sequence is correct in the life cycle of the alternation of generations? The correct answer here is A. So the gametophyte produces the gametes through mitosis, right? We're going from a multicellular haploid structure in the gametophyte to unicellular haploid structures. Even though we're changing the number of cells, we are not changing the amount of genetic information, so that is mitosis. Then those gametes fuse together, they fertilize to form the zygote, the unicellular diploid. So we've gone from haploid to diploid there. The zygote, that unicellular diploid, undergoes mitosis to increase in cell number to create the sporophyte, the multicellular diploid structure. And then the sporophyte undergoes meiosis to produce spores. Okay, so that's the correct sequence in that alternation of generations. Question number 11, a major evolutionary trend among plants is, the correct answer here is A, a reduction in the size of the sporophyte and an increase in the size of the gametophyte. That's not the correct answer. It's supposed to be this one. I think I highlighted the wrong one. This one right here, the reduction in the size of the gametophyte and the increase in the size of the sporophyte. That's the correct answer here. Right, as we are changing, as we're going through the evolutionary tree with our plants, we see that sporophyte getting bigger and bigger with our trees, right? When we look outside and we see a tree, that is the sporophyte, and the gametophyte is microscopic. We can't even see it anymore. But when we look back to more primitive plants like bryophytes, the gametophyte is actually what we look at when we see that plant. That green leafy moss is actually the haploid structure, and the sporophyte is dependent on it. But as we go through plant evolution, that gametophyte gets smaller and smaller, and that sporophyte gets larger. Question 12, the structure found in non-vascular plants that anchor them to the soil. These are the rhizoids. They're kind of like the root equivalents. So with vascular plants, we have roots, but when we have non-vascular plants, they don't have real roots. They have these rhizoids that anchor them into the soil. Question 13, a leafy plant that has no true roots, no stem, and rhizoids that grow into the soil from the leaf-like structure is what? So the choice A is a fern. So fern is a seedless vascular plant, so it has those roots, those stems. Choice C, D, and E, those are all gymnosperms and angiosperms, so they have true roots and stems as well. But liverwort there, that's one of our bryophytes, which doesn't have vascular tissue. It has those rhizoids that are growing into the soil. So that's why choice B is correct there. Question 14, in the moss life cycle, the blank generation is dominant. So mosses, again, these are our bryophytes. So they have a gametophyte generation that is dominant. This is the only group that had that dominant gametophyte generation. And our gametophytes are haploids. So this is going to be a haploid gametophyte. There is no such thing as a diploid gametophyte, and there's no such thing as a haploid sporophyte. Those just don't exist. So our choice here, the correct answer is B, haploid gametophyte. Question 15, haploid spores are produced in the blank of a moss. So they are produced in the sporangium. That is the part of the sporophyte that undergoes meiosis to produce the spores. Question 16, fertilization in the mosses is dependent upon B, water. They have those flagellated sperm. They are dependent on the water for fertilization. As we go through plant evolution, we see this trend towards becoming independent from water for fertilization, but mosses are still very much dependent. So fertilization in the later of plants, like the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, those are dependent on wind and animals to help with fertilization, but our mosses and then our seedless vascular plants both need water. Question 17, which life cycle phase is diploid in moss? This is the sporophyte. The gametophyte is always haploid. Spores are always haploid. Gametes are always haploid. The sporophyte, though, that is always going to be diploid. Question 18, which of the following is a non-vascular plant that has the longest evolutionary history on land? So here we're just picking the most primitive plant. Okay, we talked about our bryophytes, our seedless vascular plants, then our gymnosperms and angiosperms. A is a pine tree, so that's later in our gymnosperms, in our evolutionary tree much later. Our redwood tree, our ferns, our grasses, those are all going to be later in evolution, but mosses, those are our bryophytes. That's the first plant group we talked about with plant evolution, so those are going to be the ones with the longest evolutionary history. Question 19, which of the following associations is not correct? So phloem transports organic nutrients, that's correct. Vascular plants have a dominant sporophyte, that's true. Sporophyte is haploid. That's not true. So that's going to be the correct answer there. If we look at the other options, xylem conducts water up from the soil. That is true. And vascular tissue is xylem and phloem. That's also true. So C is our correct answer there. The sporophyte is never haploid. The sporophyte is always diploid. Question 20. In the life cycle of the fern, meiosis takes place. It says A, during the development of seeds. That's not true. Ferns don't have seeds. B is upon development of the gametophyte. That is not true. The gametophyte is developing via mitosis. During the development of vascular tissue, that is not true. During the production of sperm and egg, that's through mitosis. E is the correct answer here. During the production of spores. Our sporophyte has that sporangium that undergoes meiosis to produce spores. Compared to the moss, the fern is better adapted to life on land. So the correct answer here is B. It has vascular tissue. The moss does not have vascular tissue. Choice A says it produces seeds. Ferns are seedless. They don't have seeds. C says can be found in dry areas. Ferns are typically found in moist areas because they are still dependent on water for fertilization. D says that it does not have a gametophyte generation. That's not true. The fern does have a gametophyte. E says does not have swimming sperm, but the moss does. Both of those groups have flagellated swimming sperm. So choice B is our correct answer there. Question 22. In the life cycle of a fern, the zygote undergoes meiosis. That is not true. Zygote undergoes mitosis to produce the sporophyte. B does not occur. No, there definitely is a zygote in the life cycle of a fern. C becomes the gametophyte generation. The spore is what develops into the gametophyte. D is haploid. Zygote by definition is always diploid. It is a unicellular diploid structure. That's the result of fertilization. E becomes the sporophyte generation. That is true. That unicellular diploid zygote is going to undergo mitosis to increase in cell number and become the multicellular diploid sporophyte. Question 23. In the fern life cycle, the blank generation is dominant. The diploid sporophyte generation is dominant here. The only group we talked about with the dominant gametophyte were the bryophytes, the mosses. Everything else has a dominant sporophyte generation, and the sporophyte is always diploid. Question 24, which vascular plants have seeds? Gymnosperms. Out of this group here, gymnosperms is the group that has seeds. Ferns, whisk ferns, club mosses, and horsetails, none of those have seeds. Question 25, which of the following types of plants will produce a naked seed? This is also gymnosperms. So the only two out of this group that even produce seeds are angiosperms and gymnosperms. Gymnosperms have a naked seed. Angiosperms have a fully enclosed seed. But moss, algae, and ferns don't have seeds at all. Question 26. Which of these may occur in both angiosperms and gymnosperms? Choice C is the correct answer here. Pollen is carried by the wind for pollination. So this is typically how all gymnosperms are pollinated, but some angiosperms can be wind pollinated as well. Question 27. Which statement is true regarding both gymnosperms and angiosperms? Choice A is correct here. They have a separate male and female gametophyte generation. B says they both lack the gametophyte generation. That's not true. It's very, very reduced and microscopic, but they do have it. They both have swimming sperm. That is not correct. They both produce cones and flowers. Also not correct. Angiosperms are the only ones with flowers. Question 28. Monocots have their floral parts in blank, while eudicots have their parts in blank or multiples of those numbers. So monocots have flower parts in 3s. Eudicots have their flower parts in 4s or 5s. So choice D is the correct answer there. Question 29. Characteristics of eudicots include all except. So they do have 2 cotyledons. That's where the di comes from. Dicots, 2 cotyledons. Leaves with netted veins, that is true. The monocots have the parallel veins. Flower parts in 4s or 5s, we just talked about that. The monocots are in groups of 3s. D is the correct answer here. Vascular bundles arranged irregularly around the stem. That is not true. They have it in a ring structure. Question 30, a lily, which is a monocot, would have what? This is repeating one of the other questions we just saw. They have flower parts in threes. They don't have any of those other things. They do have true roots. They only have one cotyledon. They don't have their seeds in a cone, and they have parallel leaf veins. So choice B is correct. The reproductive parts of an angiosperm are the carpel and the stamen. The carpel has the female parts, and the stamen has the male parts. Question 32, the anther and the filament, those are parts of the stamen. So the anther is where the pollen is produced, and the filament is the stalk on which the anther sits. Question 33, we're just asking the definition of a fruit here. That is a mature ovary. It develops to protect that seed. Question 34, which of the following correctly illustrates the sequence of the origin of modern groups of plants? So this goes in order that we talked about in the lecture. Bryophytes are first. Those are the most primitive plants that we have. Then we get our seedless vascular plants. And then after that, we have our seed plants, our gymnosperms and angiosperms. But angiosperms are last. They are the last group. They have all sorts of characteristics that none of the other groups have, like flowers and fruits. Question 35, blank are seedless vascular plants. These are our ferns. Question 36, why are ferns considered incompletely adapted to the terrestrial environment compared to other plants? So they still have that flagellated sperm. They still require water for reproduction. So that's our correct answer there. They do have a cuticle. They do have vascular tissue. They don't have that dominant gametophyte. They have a dominant sporophyte. So choice A is the correct answer in this one. Question 37, why are gymnosperms considered to be quote unquote naked seed plants? This is because they don't have seeds that are enclosed within the ovaries. Okay, so choice C is correct there, question 37. Question 38, which structure of a flower traps pollen? The stigma sits on the top of the female reproductive parts of the flower. It's sticky, so the pollen, if it lands there, will stick there. Then it can go down the style into the ovary. Question 39, gymnosperms and angiosperms share multiple similarities. Which of the following is not a shared feature? They do both have a dominant sporophyte generation. They both have pollen grains that are male gametophytes. They both have seeds, but they don't both produce flowers. Angiosperms are the only ones that produce flowers. Question 40, in angiosperms, which structures house female gametophytes? This is the ovules. So the petals are the brightly colored pieces on the outside of the flower. The stigmas are the top of the female reproductive parts of the flower that are sticky, that traps the pollen, but it doesn't house the gametophytes. And then the sepals are on the outside of the petals that are often green. Ovules is the correct answer here. Question 41, we've got a photo here with two structures labeled. The sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte, thus making the gametophyte the dominant stage. Which structure is the sporophyte and which is the gametophyte? And is this a bryophyte, seedless vascular plant, gymnosperm, or angiosperm? So A here is the sporophyte and B is the gametophyte. So the gametophyte are the green leafy bits down here, and the stalk that comes out of the gametophyte is the sporophyte. And this is a bryophyte, right? The only type of plant that we talked about with a dominant gametophyte stage is the bryophytes. So you needed to answer both of those questions, labeling A and B and saying what kind of plant it was to get full credit. Question 42, the gametophyte pictured below is independent from the sporophyte and is photosynthetic. What type of plants have these types of gametophytes? Bryophytes, seedless vascular plants, gymnosperms, or angiosperms? And how does this compare to the gametophytes of other plant groups? So we have a gametophyte that's independent and photosynthetic. So this is going to be for our seedless vascular plants. This is kind of in between our dominant sporophyte and then our dominant gametophyte that we saw in the bryophytes. When we see our later plants like gymnosperms and angiosperms, our gametophytes are not independent. They are dependent on the sporophyte for everything. But with our seedless vascular plants, we're kind of in the middle. there with our independent gametophyte. So this is a seedless vascular plants. In these plants, the gametophytes are independent and photosynthetic. In gymnosperms and angiosperms, gametophyte is dependent on the sporophyte, and in bryophytes, sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte. So this is just kind of in between. Question 43, in the photo below, we needed to say if it's a bryophyte, seedless vascular plant, gymnosperm, or angiosperm, and how do we know that? So this is a gymnosperm. Anything that's a conifer and has those cones is going to be a member of the gymnosperm group. They have these naked seeds that develop in those cones. Question 44, so what type of plant is this? This is an angiosperm, and we know that because it's a flower. If it's a flower, it's an angiosperm. And then the last question, is it a monocot or a eudicot? This is a monocot. If we count those petals, there are 6. So the flower parts are in multiples of 3. So let me know if you have any questions on any points you might have missed on that quiz. And then you can expect to see some questions from all of these quizzes on our final quiz that's going to happen coming up here on the 11th. So make sure you are reviewing all of these and let me know if you have any questions.